Let's start with a house number. In 1988, Ronald Reagan and his wife Nancy were preparing to move into their retirement home in Bel Air, California. The address of that house was 666 St. Cloud Road. And they changed it. They literally petitioned the city and had it officially renamed 668 St. Cloud Road, because neither of them could stomach the idea of living at 666 anything. This is the 40th President of the United States, the most powerful man on earth at that time, a man who had faced down the Soviet Union, and he was rattled by a house number. That tells you everything you need to know about how deep this thing runs. But here is the strange part, the part nobody tells you up front. The word Antichrist does not appear in the book of Revelation, not once. You have probably spent your entire life assuming that the beast, the 666, the mark on the hand and the forehead, all of that is connected to a single figure called the Antichrist, described in vivid detail in Revelation. But that's not what the text actually says. The word Antichrist appears exactly 4 times in the entire Bible, and all 4 of those appearances are in the short letters of 1st and 2nd John, tiny epistles near the back of the New Testament, written to address specific arguments happening inside early Christian communities. In those letters, John isn't describing a single cosmic supervillain. He's saying the spirit of Antichrist is already in the world, plural, referring to people who deny that Jesus came in the flesh. It's a theological category, not a biography. So everything, the monster, the biography, the mark, the number, all of that got assembled from completely different texts by different people across centuries, stitched together into a coherent mythology that doesn't actually exist as one thing in the original source material. The Antichrist, as most people understand the concept, is a construction, a collage. And understanding how it got built reveals something genuinely disturbing about how human beings manage their fear. Go back further than Christianity. Go back to the centuries before Jesus was born, to a group of Jewish scholars living in the desert near the Dead Sea, who were, by any measure, some of the most anxious people in the ancient world. The caves of Qumran, discovered in 1947 by a Bedouin shepherd boy, contained the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the most significant archaeological finds in human history. These scrolls belonged to a Jewish sect called the Essenes, a tight, strict, apocalyptically minded community who had basically decided that the rest of the world was so corrupt, so spiritually compromised, that the only rational response was to retreat into the desert and wait for God to come clean it all up. They were not passive people. They were intense, organized, deeply literate, and they had developed a sophisticated theological framework for understanding evil. Their name for the principle of evil was Belial. In Hebrew, the word literally translates to something like worthlessness or without value. But in Essene theology, it became something much more specific, a personified force of darkness, the opposite of the angel of light, commanding an entire army of spiritual darkness in a cosmic war. The Essenes believed they were living through the final chapter of that war. They expected an imminent apocalyptic battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, with Belial leading the opposing side. They even wrote out a battle manual for this war. It's called the War Scroll, and it's detailed enough to include troop formations and trumpet signals for the final confrontation between good and evil. This matters because it shows that before anyone had heard of Jesus or an Antichrist, there was already a fully developed intellectual tradition of imagining a powerful, deceptive, charismatic figure of cosmic evil who would oppose God and seduce humanity. The Essenes didn't invent this idea from nothing. They were drawing on even older material, particularly a strange and influential text called the Book of Daniel. Daniel is unlike most of the Hebrew Bible. It was written during a genuine crisis, a real, specific political catastrophe that left Jewish communities traumatized and desperate for a theological explanation. Around 167 BCE, a Greek Seleucid king named Antiochus IV Epiphanes decided to complete the cultural assimilation of Judea into Greek civilization by force. He banned Jewish religious practice, Torah study, circumcision, Sabbath observance, all of it. The penalty was death.
Then he walked into the holiest place in the ancient Jewish world, the temple in Jerusalem, and he sacrificed a pig on the altar. A pig on the altar, in the Holy of Holies. For a Jewish audience, this was not just politically outrageous, it was cosmically obscene. The temple wasn't simply a building, it was the dwelling place of God on earth, the axis of the universe, the point at which heaven and earth touched. And this foreign king, this man who had renamed himself after Zeus, Epiphanes literally means God manifest. His enemies called him Epimanes, which means the mad one, had walked in and done the most defiling thing imaginable. He didn't just conquer Judea, he tried to erase the structure of reality as Jews understood it. The book of Daniel was written to make sense of this.
It used coded, symbolic language. Animals with horns, beasts rising from seas, a little horn that speaks boastfully and persecutes the holy ones, to describe Antiochus without saying his name outright, because the text was being circulated underground, in a context where saying the wrong thing could get you killed. But the imagery created a template, a blueprint for understanding a specific kind of evil, the powerful man who appoints himself divine, who desecrates what is sacred, who demands worship and destroys those who refuse. That blueprint would be applied again and again over the next 2,000 years to a long list of different people. Now step forward to the 1st century CE, to Rome, to a city that has just experienced a catastrophe so dramatic that it changed the psychology of an entire civilization. In July of 64 CE, a fire broke out in Rome. It burned for 6 days and 7 nights. When it was done, 3 of the city's 14 districts were completely gone, and 7 more were in ruins. Hundreds of thousands of people were left homeless. The city was devastated. And then the rumors started that the emperor had started it, that Nero had wanted the land cleared so he could build his grand new palace complex, the Domus Aurea, his golden house. Whether or not that's true, Nero needed a scapegoat, and so he found one. He blamed a small, obscure religious minority that most Romans already found strange and antisocial. He blamed the Christians. What followed was the first systematic imperial persecution of Christians, and it was deliberate, theatrical, and vicious. Christians were arrested, dressed in animal skins to be torn apart by dogs, crucified or covered in pitch and set alight at night to illuminate Nero's garden parties. He used them as human torches. The Roman historian Tacitus describes this and notes that even Romans who hated Christians felt this was excessive. For early Christian communities, this was the terror, the living embodiment of the beast that persecutes the saints, the power that demands absolute allegiance and burns alive those who refuse to give it. This is the world in which the book of Revelation was written, and you have to understand that. Revelation is not a prediction of 21st century events. It's a survival document, written in the coded language of apocalyptic literature to a specific persecuted community about their specific political situation. The author, called John of Patmos, is writing to 7 churches in the Roman province of Asia, communities that are being ground between Roman power and their own convictions. And the beast of Revelation, the one with 666, is not a future monster. It's a commentary on a present reality, written in a code that readers at the time would have immediately understood. The code is called gematria. It's the ancient practice of assigning numerical values to letters and using those values to encode or decode names. Every letter in Greek and Hebrew has a numerical equivalent. You add them up, and you get a name number. This was not obscure, it was widely understood. Graffiti from Pompeii has been found that says, I love the one whose number is 545. People used it routinely to speak about real people without using their actual names, useful when the person you're talking about could have you arrested. Work out the Hebrew gematria of Nero Caesar, and you get 666. This is not a coincidence. This is the point. John of Patmos is encoding the name of the emperor, using a system his readers would recognize, to tell them clearly, the beast is Nero. And if you're confused by the fact that some early manuscript fragments say 616 instead of 666, that's because 616 is what you get if you do the same calculation using the Latin spelling of Nero's name. Different scribes used different spelling conventions, and the number changed accordingly. There was not a typo. There were two versions of the same code. Nero died in 68 CE, supposedly by suicide, a knife to the throat, in a farmhouse outside Rome. But in the ancient world, a man as powerful and terrifying as Nero does not simply die. The myth started almost immediately. Nero hadn't died, he had escaped to the east, to the Parthian Empire, and he was gathering an army. He was coming back. He would return with an enormous force and take revenge on everyone who had turned against him. This mythology is called Nero Redivivus, Nero Reborn, and it ran for decades.
Multiple people actually impersonated Nero during this period, claiming to be the returned emperor and gathering armed followers. Roman and Greek sources document at least 3 such false Neros. The psychological template here, the tyrant who dies but returns from the east, is ancient and persistent, and it maps almost perfectly onto the apocalyptic tradition of the returning cosmic enemy. Now take all of that raw material, Belial, Daniel's little horn, Nero's atrocities, the Nero Redivivus myth, the coded 666, and hand it to medieval European Christianity. Watch what happens. By the early medieval period, Christianity has become the official religion of the Roman Empire, and then the dominant framework of all of European civilization. The Antichrist is no longer an underground political code, it is mainstream theology. And mainstream theology demands biography.
If there is going to be an Antichrist, you need to know what he will look like, where he will come from, what he will do, so that when he arrives, good Christians can identify and resist him. In 954 CE, a French Benedictine monk named Adzo of Montier-en-Der wrote a letter to Queen Gerberga of West Francia. The letter was titled On the Origin and Life of the Antichrist, and it assembled, for the first time in one coherent document, the full fictional biography of the Antichrist. It became enormously influential, copied, translated, distributed across Europe for centuries. Adzo's checklist is specific and strange. The Antichrist will be born from the tribe of Dan, a reference to the Hebrew tribe mentioned in Genesis, later absent from the list of tribes in Revelation, which was interpreted as meaning they had been cursed. His mother will be a corrupted woman, sometimes described as a whore, sometimes as a fake virgin, always as a fallen woman used as a vessel by demonic power. He will be conceived and born through the agency of the devil in a perversion of the virgin birth. He will be raised in the cities of Bethsaida and Chorazin, cities that Jesus had cursed in the Gospels. He will be educated in magic and sorcery by demons. He will perform miracles, not real miracles, but demonic simulations of miracles, convincing enough to deceive everyone except the truly faithful. He will rebuild the Jerusalem temple and install himself in it as God. And just before the final judgment, 2 specific biblical prophets, Enoch, who was taken bodily to heaven without dying, and Elijah, who was also taken up alive, will return to earth, preach against the Antichrist, convert masses of people, and be physically killed by him. Then God will intervene. This is elaborate theological fan fiction, assembled from fragments of different biblical texts, filtered through centuries of commentary, and shaped into a coherent narrative arc with a beginning, a middle, and an ending. And once it existed, it became an extraordinarily useful weapon. Because if you have a detailed checklist of what the Antichrist looks like, you can hold that checklist up against your enemies. This is what happened in the 13th century, in one of the most vicious propaganda wars in European history. Pope Gregory IX and Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, a man his contemporaries called Stupor Mundi, wonder of the world, because he was genuinely brilliant, spoke 6 languages, wrote poetry, kept exotic animals, ran one of the most sophisticated courts in Europe, spent the last decades of their lives trying to destroy each other. And both sides reached for the same weapon. Gregory IX officially declared Frederick II to be the Beast of Revelation. He used that language, the beast, in papal documents circulated across Christendom. He accused Frederick of denying the immortality of the soul, of calling Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad impostors, of calling the Eucharist a fraud.
Frederick, in turn, issued his own counter-propaganda, declaring the Pope the Antichrist, saying the papacy was the true Babylon, that Rome was more interested in wealth and power than in God, that the institution itself was the enemy of true faith. 2 of the most powerful men in the world, officially declaring each other to be the literal cosmic enemy of God, in writing, circulated widely, and people took it seriously, because the idea that the Antichrist could be a current, living, institutional power, not just a future monster, was entirely within the established theological tradition. Meanwhile, all of this was happening in a world that had, for several centuries, been experiencing the most significant civilizational collision in the medieval period, the encounter with Islam.
The rapid expansion of Islamic empires in the 7th and 8th centuries, across the Middle East, North Africa, the Iberian Peninsula, was, to medieval European Christianity, not just a political and military shock. It was a theological crisis. How could God allow this? How could the lands of the Bible, the holy cities, the birthplace of Christianity, fall under the dominion of a different faith? The apocalyptic framework offered an answer. This was part of the end times sequence. And almost immediately, medieval Christian writers began identifying the Prophet Muhammad as either the Antichrist himself or as the Antichrist's forerunner. This was not a fringe view. It was mainstream medieval theology, stated plainly in texts by serious scholars. What is less often acknowledged in Western histories is that the Islamic tradition had its own terrifying answer to this kind of cosmic enemy. The figure is called Al-Masih ad-Dajjal, the false Messiah, the deceiver. And the descriptions of the Dajjal in Hadith literature, the recorded sayings and traditions of the Prophet, are strikingly specific and psychologically rich. The Dajjal is described as a man with one functioning eye. The other eye is described as like a floating grape, pale, protuberant, and defective, an eye that looks at you but doesn't work properly. On his forehead, visible to any believer, are the letters spelling kafir, unbeliever or infidel. He will emerge during a time of great tribulation, of drought and famine, and he will have almost supernatural control over rain and grain. He will command the earth to produce, and it will produce. He will command the treasury, and it will follow him. And this is the most psychologically interesting detail. He will offer material rewards, food, water, wealth, to people who follow him, and he will withhold them from those who don't. His power is entirely economic and material. He doesn't primarily threaten violence. He dangles comfort. He makes following him feel like the rational choice when the alternative is suffering. The Dajjal will claim to be a prophet, then claim to be God. He will travel the earth at extraordinary speed, reaching every corner except the 2 cities of Mecca and Medina, which he cannot enter. Ordinary believers will be deceived. Only the most spiritually aware will see through him, because they will see the word on his forehead. This is a remarkable piece of psychological theology. The Dajjal isn't a simple monster. He's a sophisticated test. His appeal is to human vulnerability, to the hunger that makes people choose short-term material comfort over spiritual integrity when the material situation is desperate enough. He exploits the gap between what people need and what they believe. Both the Christian and Islamic traditions are, in their respective figures, building a portrait of the same underlying human fear. That the most dangerous evil doesn't come wearing obvious darkness, it comes offering you exactly what you want. Now skip forward to 1517, to a German monk nailing his grievances to a church door in Wittenberg, and watch the Antichrist become a political nuclear bomb. Martin Luther was not the first person to accuse the Pope of being the Antichrist. Frederick II and the spiritual Franciscans and Jan Hus had gotten there before him. But Luther was the first to build an entire theological system around that accusation and distribute it via the printing press to a literate European public that was already fed up with Rome. And crucially, Luther was not accusing a specific individual pope of being the Antichrist. He was accusing the office, the institution. The papacy as a system was, in Luther's theology, the Antichrist. The power that had placed itself between the believer and God, that had corrupted scripture with human tradition, that had built an empire on fear and commerce, selling indulgences, trafficking in sacred things. This is theologically significant in a way that is hard to overstate. When the Antichrist was a future individual, you could wait for him. You could be vigilant. You could imagine identifying and resisting him when he arrived. When the Antichrist is an existing institution, a system, a structure, an ongoing operation, there is nothing to wait for. It's already here. You are already inside it. And there is no negotiating with it, no reforming it from within, no compromise. If Rome is the beast, then every Catholic is complicit in the beast's work. And there is no version of this that ends with dialogue. The theological dehumanization that followed contributed directly to the most violent century in European history before the 20th century. The 30 Years' War, which ran from 1618 to 1648, was not simply a political conflict about territory and sovereignty. It was a civilizational war about ultimate reality, prosecuted with the conviction that the enemy was not just wrong, but cosmically evil. 8 million people died. Entire regions of Central Europe lost a third, a half, in some places nearly all of their population to war, famine, and plague. Bohemia may have lost a third of its people. Some estimates for the German territories as a whole run to 30% population loss. You don't negotiate with a percentage. You don't find a diplomatic solution. You fight a war of extermination, because that's what you do with the literal beast of the apocalypse. When apocalyptic theology convinces people they are fighting cosmic evil, the human cost of the conflict becomes acceptable as the price of spiritual survival. That is not a bug of the Antichrist mythology. It is one of its core functions as a political weapon. Now drag this template into the modern era and watch it get applied to a new cast of characters every generation, with total consistency and total failure every time. Napoleon Bonaparte. The return from Elba in 1815, after his first exile, triggered an enormous wave of Antichrist identification across European Protestant and evangelical communities. Here was a man who had conquered most of Europe, reorganized society according to rational principles that overturned centuries of traditional order, crowned himself emperor in the presence of the Pope, and then died and came back. The return from Elba mapped almost perfectly onto the Nero Redivivus myth, the beast that receives a deadly wound and recovers. Preachers pointed to it from pulpits. pamphlets circulated. Napoleon was the beast, the little horn, the desolator. And then he lost at Waterloo and was exiled to St. Helena and died of stomach cancer, and the whole framework had to be quietly folded up and put away until the next candidate arrived. There were always more candidates. The 19th and 20th centuries offered an abundance of material. Every major catastrophe, every terrifying political figure, every seismic disruption triggered a fresh wave of identification. Kaiser Wilhelm, then Hitler, who in some estimations was so obviously the fulfillment of the prophecies that entire books were written mapping his biography to the Antichrist checklist. The charismatic power, the persecution of the Jews, the messianic self-presentation, the total war. Then Stalin, then Mussolini. After World War II, when it became embarrassing to have been so completely wrong about Hitler, the focus shifted. Henry Kissinger became a candidate for a while, partly because he was Jewish, partly because of elaborate gematria calculations applied to his name. Then there was a sustained campaign around Mikhail Gorbachev in the 1980s, and this one is particularly interesting because it was based on something entirely physical. Gorbachev had a visible port wine birthmark on his forehead. A mark on his forehead. The exegetical gymnastics performed to connect this to the mark of the beast were genuinely impressive in their creativity. And then Saddam Hussein, who made things easier by literally rebuilding the ruins of Babylon and having his name stamped on the bricks, invoking the specific symbolic geography of apocalyptic prophecy with what seems in retrospect like almost deliberate provocation, though it was actually Iraqi nationalism. Each time, the identification was made with absolute certainty. Each time, the person died without inaugurating the end of the world. And each time, the failure was simply absorbed, the framework adjusted, and attention shifted to the next candidate. But something was starting to shift in the latter half of the 20th century. The fears were becoming less focused on individual human beings and more focused on systems, on technology, on infrastructure. In the early 1970s, American evangelical culture was electrified by a very specific anxiety about supermarket barcodes. The Universal Product Code, the barcode, was being rolled out across American retail, and it triggered a wave of end-times concern that now seems almost quaint, but was entirely sincere and was taken seriously by millions of people. The concern was based on a technical misreading of how barcodes work. The EAN13 barcode format uses what are called guard bars, thin double lines at the beginning, middle, and end of each barcode, which help the scanner orient and read the code correctly. Someone noticed that these guard bars bore a visual resemblance to the number 6 in the barcode's encoding system. 3 sets of guard bars, 3 sixes. 666. The mark of the beast, hidden in the structure of commercial exchange, quietly present on every product in every store, every time you bought something. The barcode thing was wrong. The guard bars are not encoded sixes. They're a different type of marker entirely, and the system doesn't work that way. But the fear attached to something real about the modern economy that genuinely was alarming if you thought about it carefully. By the 1980s and 1990s, the credit card was added to the concern. A cashless payment system. A card that tracked your purchases, linked to your identity, without which you increasingly could not buy or sell, which is exactly the language of Revelation about the mark of the beast. And then, RFID chips. The idea of a chip implanted under the skin, which could identify you anywhere, which could track your movements and transactions, became the dominant mark of the beast candidate in the early 2000s, accelerating after 9/11 and the general expansion of surveillance infrastructure. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Bill Gates became one of the most prominent Antichrist candidates the modern era has produced. The specific theory, that the vaccines contained microchips, or that Gates was using the pandemic to roll out a global digital identification and tracking system, was a technological recapitulation of the ancient fear. A single powerful man using crisis and the promise of health to implant a mark in the body of every human being, giving him control over who could participate in society and who couldn't. The detail of the mark in the hand, or mark on the forehead, from Revelation, was mapped onto vaccine injection sites. And the underlying structure of the fear, that a globalist elite was using a technological infrastructure to establish total control over human life, was the same template that had been applied to Nero, to the Pope, to Napoleon, to every candidate for 2,000 years. Today, the candidates have multiplied and dispersed. Artificial intelligence, facial recognition systems, central bank digital currencies, social credit systems. The digital infrastructure of the 21st century has provided an almost inexhaustible supply of raw material for the pattern matching that produces Antichrist candidates. And unlike individual human beings, systems don't die. They don't go into exile. They don't get cancer. They just grow. And this is where you have to stop and look at what this whole pattern actually reveals, because it's genuinely unsettling, and not in the way the mythology itself is unsettling. The Antichrist has always been a mirror. Every era, every community that has engaged with this mythology has used it to externalize and project the specific fears of their historical moment onto a single figure or system. The Roman persecutions produced Nero. The anxiety about Islamic expansion produced Muhammad as Antichrist. The corruption of the medieval church produced the Protestant Antichrist. Industrial modernity produced technological fear. Surveillance capitalism produced the chip and the digital mark. In each case, real concerns about power, about control, about the corruption of institutions, about the concentration of economic and political authority, were taken, transformed into apocalyptic language, attached to a supernatural figure or system, and processed through a framework that made them feel both more comprehensible and, paradoxically, less actionable. Because that's the thing nobody says out loud about the Antichrist mythology, and it's the most important observation you can make about its 2,000-year history. When you are waiting for a supernatural monster, you are not looking at the real thing. The medieval peasant convinced the Pope was the Antichrist was responding in a distorted way to real corruption, to the genuine power of the church, to indulgences and institutional abuse and political manipulation. But the apocalyptic frame transforms that real institutional problem into a cosmic drama with a supernatural solution. You don't need to organize or reform or build alternative institutions or fight for structural change. You just need to hold on until God intervenes. The monster will be defeated at the end by divine action, not human effort. The American evangelical convinced that barcodes or microchips are the mark of the beast is responding in a distorted way to real concerns about the surveillance economy, about corporate control of personal data, about the increasingly mediated and tracked nature of modern life. These are genuine problems worth engaging with seriously and politically. But the apocalyptic frame takes those real concerns and roots them through a supernatural narrative that makes political engagement feel irrelevant. If this is prophecy being fulfilled, if this is the ordained unfolding of the end times, then what exactly is the point of writing to your congressman? The Antichrist mythology is, among other things, a mechanism for converting legitimate political anxiety into theological paralysis. It makes real problems feel cosmic and therefore unsolvable by ordinary means, while simultaneously giving the believer the intense psychological satisfaction of feeling like they understand what's really going on. They have the secret knowledge that unlocks the hidden meaning of current events. And the cost of that mechanism, compounded over 2,000 years, has been enormous. Not because the mythology is false, it's mythology. Truth is not the primary register, but because the psychological and political work it does consistently redirects human attention away from the actual mechanics of how power operates, how institutions corrupt themselves, how ordinary incremental authoritarianism builds itself quietly in the spaces between the spectacular disasters we're trained to watch for. The real dangerous thing in any era is almost never the one that fits the template. It's the one that doesn't look like the template at all. It's not the ranting dictator with theatrical rallies who proclaims himself divine. It's the bureaucratic drift, the slow erosion of norms, the incremental normalization of things that should not be normal, carried out by people who seem reasonable and who offer perfectly rational justifications for each individual step. 2,000 years of looking for the beast, and we are still consistently surprised by the boring, procedural, institutionally embedded nature of actual evil. Because actual evil rarely has a mark on its forehead. It usually comes with a benefits package and a coherent narrative about why this particular concentration of power is, actually, for your own good. Maybe that's the thing. Maybe the real revelation at the end of all this, at the end of the Essene scrolls and Daniel's visions and Nero's torches and Adzo's checklist and Luther's hammer and Napoleon's return and Gorbachev's birthmark and the barcodes and the chips and the vaccines, is that the monster we've spent 2,000 years scanning the horizon for is the one we keep manufacturing for ourselves. Not through supernatural corruption, but through the perfectly ordinary human combination of fear and power and the desperate desire to believe that someone else is responsible for what we've built. We are, and always have been, very good at finding the beast. We are considerably less good at looking in the mirror while we do it.